The morning of October 26, 1942, southeast of Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Commander James Henry Flatley stood on the flight deck of USS Enterprise, watching his air group prepare for launch against a Japanese carrier task force. The ship's forward centerline elevator rose slowly from the hangar deck, carrying 4 Wildcat fighters into position. 57 seconds. That's how long it took for the massive platform to complete its journey.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special.
Locking into place with a metallic thud that resonated through the steel deck. Behind him, the aft centerline elevator was still down, trapped in the hangar with 6 more aircraft waiting to ascend. The gap in the flight deck created an obstacle that forced deck crews to maneuver aircraft around it, consuming precious minutes as Japanese bombers closed the distance. Flatley had flown from carriers for 8 years. He understood the mathematics of naval aviation with brutal clarity. Every second an aircraft remained on deck was a second it couldn't be in the air defending the ship. Every minute spent repositioning planes around an elevator opening was a minute the carrier remained vulnerable. The Enterprise carried 90 aircraft. Getting them all into the air required nearly 2 hours under perfect conditions that never existed in combat. 300 miles to the southeast, USS Wasp sat at the bottom of the Pacific, torpedoed and sunk the previous month. Before her loss, she had represented something different. She was smaller than Enterprise, displacing 14,000 tons compared to Enterprise's 19,000. She carried fewer aircraft. Her engines generated less power. By every conventional measure, Wasp should have been inferior to the larger Yorktown-class carriers like Enterprise. Yet Wasp could spot and launch aircraft faster than any carrier in the fleet. The reason hung on her port side like an afterthought. A folding platform that swung up from the hangar deck on hydraulic arms, delivering aircraft directly to the flight deck edge without cutting a hole through the center of the operating surface. The deck edge elevator. Naval architects had installed it on Wasp as an experiment, a weight-saving measure forced by treaty limitations that capped her displacement. Nobody expected it to revolutionize carrier operations. Nobody anticipated that this compromise solution would solve a problem that had plagued carrier aviation since the first aircraft launched from a ship's deck. The problem of how to get aircraft from storage to flight operations without turning the flight deck into an obstacle course. The United States Navy had been operating aircraft carriers for 20 years by the time Wasp commissioned in April 1940. Langley, the first American carrier converted from a collier in 1922, established the basic pattern. Aircraft stored in an enclosed hangar below the flight deck, elevators to lift them to the operating surface, launch them, recover them, strike them back down to the hangar for maintenance and rearming. The cycle repeated thousands of times, but the fundamental limitation remained constant. Every elevator created a hole in the flight deck, a hole that couldn't be crossed by aircraft or deck crew, a hole that divided the flight deck into separate sections, each requiring its own spotting pattern, its own taxi routes, its own careful choreography. Lexington and Saratoga, converted from battle cruiser hulls in the late 1920s, carried 2 centerline elevators. So did Ranger, commissioned in 1934. Yorktown and Enterprise, completed in 1937 and 1938, continued the pattern. 3 centerline elevators positioned at bow, amidships, and stern. The standard arrangement, the proven arrangement. The arrangement that nobody questioned until they examined what Wasp achieved with her strange side-mounted platform. The folding elevator on Wasp consisted of a platform for the front wheels and an outrigger for the tail wheel. 2 hydraulic arms moved the platform in a half-circle up and down between flight deck and hangar deck. The mechanism occupied no flight deck space when raised. When lowered, it left the entire flight deck available for operations. No holes, no gaps, no artificial divisions of the operating surface. Aircraft could be brought up from the hangar while launches continued from the bow. They could be struck below while recoveries proceeded at the stern. The elevator served aircraft flow without interrupting flight operations. The Navy's Bureau of Ships recognized the innovation immediately. When war planners drafted requirements for the Essex-class fleet carriers in 1939, they specified 3 elevators, 2 centerline, as tradition demanded, and 1 deck-edge unit on the port side amidships, replicating Wasp's design at larger scale. The Essex class would be built in numbers that dwarfed previous carrier construction, 24 hulls authorized, 14 completed in time to fight in the Pacific War, every one equipped with the deck-edge elevator that treaty limitations had forced onto Wasp. The decision carried implications that extended beyond simple aircraft flow. Centerline elevators required massive structural support. Steel beams had to carry the weight of aircraft and elevator platform through the ship's structure to the keel. The opening had to be reinforced against the twisting forces that affected every ship at sea. Hydraulic machinery, cables, and electrical systems filled compartments below the hangar deck. A centerline elevator represented hundreds of tons of structural weight and thousands of man-hours of maintenance. Deck-edge elevators simplified the engineering problem dramatically. The platform hung outside the hull structure, its weight transferred to the side of the ship rather than through multiple decks. The machinery occupied less space. Maintenance crews reported 20% fewer man-hours required compared to centerline units. The savings in weight and complexity meant more fuel, more ammunition, more aviation gasoline stored aboard, more of everything that extended the carrier's reach and striking power. But these advantages remained theoretical until combat revealed the fundamental difference between the 2 elevator types. Battle damage. The Pacific War taught hard lessons about carrier vulnerability. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes targeted American carriers with ruthless efficiency. Bombs penetrated flight decks, torpedoes tore open hulls. Fire swept through hangars filled with fueled and armed aircraft. Every carrier that survived early battles carried scars. Enterprise survived because damage control parties contained fires and shored up damaged structure. Saratoga survived 2 torpedo hits through sheer size and compartmentation. Yorktown at Coral Sea and Midway demonstrated that carriers could absorb tremendous punishment and continue operating. Until they couldn't. Centerline elevators presented a specific vulnerability that deck-edge units avoided. A bomb hit on a centerline elevator didn't just damage the mechanism, it created a hole in the flight deck that couldn't be easily repaired. The structural damage extended through multiple decks. Repairs required shipyard facilities and weeks of work. A carrier with a damaged centerline elevator lost more than an elevator. She lost a section of flight deck. She lost the ability to spot aircraft efficiently. She lost combat effectiveness out of proportion to the physical damage. Enterprise experienced this reality on October 26, 1942 during the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. A Japanese bomb struck near the forward elevator. The blast damaged the platform and jammed the mechanism. Enterprise couldn't raise or lower the forward elevator. The hole in the flight deck remained, forcing deck crews to work around it. Aircraft operations continued, but with reduced efficiency. Every launch and recovery took longer. The ship remained in combat, but wounded in ways that statistics couldn't capture. A deck-edge elevator, by contrast, occupied no flight deck space. Damage to the mechanism might render it inoperable, but the flight deck remained intact. Aircraft operations continued uninterrupted. The carrier maintained her offensive capability even with an elevator out of commission. This wasn't theoretical. This was the difference between a wounded ship that continued fighting and a wounded ship that withdrew from battle. The Essex class incorporated this lesson from inception. The deck-edge elevator positioned on the port side amidships served as the primary aircraft handling route during flight operations. The 2 centerline elevators, forward and aft, provided backup capacity and allowed simultaneous operations. But the deck-edge unit carried the heaviest load during sustained operations. It could raise aircraft while the forward catapults launched strikes. It could lower aircraft while the arresting gear caught recoveries. It never interrupted the flow. Navy planners in 1940 didn't know these advantages with certainty. They adopted the deck-edge elevator because it worked on Wasp and offered engineering benefits. They positioned 3 elevators to partition the hangar deck into quarters, each section dedicated to different maintenance functions.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
They calculated elevator capacity and cycle times to support sustained operations. They did the mathematics. But mathematics couldn't predict combat reality. Combat revealed that elevator positioning determined aircraft flow with precision that surprised even experienced aviators. The forward centerline elevator on Essex-class carriers measured 60 feet by 40 feet, large enough to handle any aircraft in the inventory, except the largest patrol bombers. The aft centerline elevator matched these dimensions. The deck edge elevator on the port side measured 60 feet by 34 feet, slightly narrower, but positioned precisely where aircraft needed to move during flight operations. Under normal operating conditions, with the carrier steaming into the wind for launch, the forward centerline elevator brought aircraft from hangar to flight deck. Deck crews positioned them for catapult launch or taxi to the bow. The deck edge elevator simultaneously brought additional aircraft up, spotting them aft of the island structure where they could be armed, fueled, and prepared for the next launch cycle. The aft centerline elevator remained available for emergency use or to handle aircraft returning from the previous strike. During recovery operations, with the carrier again steaming into the wind, the process reversed. Aircraft trapped on the arresting cables and taxied forward. The deck edge elevator struck them below to the hangar, while the aft centerline elevator stood ready for overflow. The forward elevator brought up fresh aircraft for the next launch. The cycle continued with mechanical precision, limited only by the speed of deck crews and the efficiency of hangar operations below. Wasp never survived to prove the concept in sustained combat. Torpedoed on September 15, 1942 by Japanese submarine I-19, she sank with heavy casualties. But her legacy lived on in every Essex-class carrier that followed. The deck edge elevator that naval architects installed as a weight-saving compromise became the standard for American carrier design. By 1943, when the first Essex-class ships joined the fleet, the superiority of the deck edge arrangement had become doctrine. The numbers documented the transformation. Pre-war carriers like Lexington and Saratoga required approximately 90 minutes to launch their complete air groups under ideal conditions. Essex-class carriers could launch comparable numbers in less than 60 minutes. The difference came from elevator positioning and flight deck layout, but primarily from the deck edge unit that never interrupted operations. An improvement of 30 minutes might seem modest on paper. In combat, when Japanese strike packages approached at 300 miles per hour, 30 minutes meant the difference between intercepting attackers at safe distance and fighting them over the task force. The psychological impact on flight deck crews proved equally significant. Sailors who had worked carriers with only centerline elevators adapted to the deck edge design within days. The ability to move aircraft continuously without waiting for elevator cycles transformed their workflow. They could plan sequences knowing that aircraft would flow from hangar to flight deck without interruption. They could position planes for launch while others armed and fueled. They could maintain the rhythm that sustained operations demanded. Pilots noticed different improvements. Pre-launch tensions derived partly from the cramped spotting of aircraft on flight decks divided by elevator openings. Wingtips cleared each other by feet. Props churned inches from the next plane's tail. Every taxi required absolute precision. The deck edge elevator allowed more open spotting patterns. Aircraft had room to maneuver. The risk of ground collisions decreased. Pilots could focus on their missions rather than avoiding their neighbor's propeller. Yet the transformation occurred without fanfare or recognition. No admirals issued proclamations about revolutionary elevator designs. No Navy Department press releases celebrated the innovation. The deck edge elevator simply worked, fulfilling its function so reliably that it became invisible. Only when compared to earlier carriers did its advantages become apparent. Only when engineers calculated the maintenance savings and structural benefits did the full scope of improvement emerge. Only when combat demonstrated the vulnerability of centerline elevators did the wisdom of the deck edge arrangement prove itself completely. The Treaty of Washington, signed in 1922, limited carrier tonnage among major naval powers. The United States received an allocation of 135,000 tons for aircraft carriers. Lexington and Saratoga consumed 66,000 tons as converted battlecruisers. Ranger added 14,500 tons. Yorktown and Enterprise together consumed 40,000 tons. By 1936, when planning began for WASP, only 14,700 tons remained in the American allocation. The Navy faced a choice: build no additional carrier, forfeiting the remaining tonnage, or design a carrier to fit the available displacement. Naval architects accepted the challenge. They designed WASP with every weight-saving measure available: reduced armor, lighter machinery producing 75,000 shaft horsepower instead of the 120,000 in larger carriers, thinner hull plating, and the deck-edge elevator that weighed significantly less than a comparable centerline unit while providing superior functionality. The treaty limitation forced innovation. The innovation proved superior to conventional design. The Navy adopted it fleet-wide. This pattern of forced innovation producing unexpected benefits repeated throughout naval history. Aircraft carriers themselves emerged from treaty limitations that restricted battleship construction. Angled flight decks, steam catapults, and optical landing systems all developed because conventional approaches proved inadequate. The deck-edge elevator fit this tradition perfectly, a compromise solution that became the preferred standard. By 1943, American shipyards were completing Essex-class carriers at a rate unprecedented in naval construction. Newport News Shipbuilding delivered Yorktown in April, the second ship of the class and first to see combat. Intrepid followed in August. Hornet joined the fleet in November. These ships and their sisters carried the deck-edge elevator into every major engagement of the Pacific War: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Truk, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The names marked stages in America's advance across the Pacific, and Essex-class carriers fought every battle. Their air groups grew larger as the war progressed. Early Essex carriers operated with air groups of 80 aircraft. By 1945, this had increased to over 90 planes, including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. The larger air groups required more efficient aircraft handling. The deck-edge elevator provided exactly this efficiency, moving aircraft from hangar to flight deck and back with mechanical reliability that kept operations flowing during the sustained campaigns of the war's final year. The Japanese pilots who attacked Essex-class carriers in 1944 and 1945 faced aircraft defenses that previous attackers had never encountered. American carriers could launch combat air patrols continuously throughout daylight hours. They could recover, rearm, and relaunch defensive fighters faster than Japanese strike coordinators anticipated. The deck-edge elevator contributed directly to this defensive capability by maintaining aircraft flow that never paused for elevator cycles. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, commanding Air Group 15 aboard Essex, understood this advantage with the clarity that comes from experience. On June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, he led 9 Hellcat fighters against a massive Japanese strike approaching Task Force 58. The engagement that followed became known among American aviators as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. McCampbell personally shot down 7 Japanese aircraft that day, but the broader story lay in numbers that revealed American carrier superiority. Japanese carrier aviation launched 4 major strikes, totaling 373 aircraft against the American task force. American combat air patrols and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 243 of them. Only 29 penetrated to attack positions. The interception rate exceeded 65%, a level of defensive success unprecedented in carrier warfare. That defensive success depended on maintaining constant fighter coverage, which required rapid launch and recovery cycles that the deck-edge elevator enabled. Essex-class carriers operating during the Philippine Sea engagement launched and recovered aircraft continuously for 12 hours. Hellcat fighters trapped aboard, taxied to the deck-edge elevator, struck below for rearming and refueling, then returned to the flight deck for relaunch. The cycle repeated dozens of times per aircraft, Pilots reported turnaround times of less than 30 minutes from trap to relaunch when hangar crews worked efficiently. This rapid turnaround maintained the defensive barrier that destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. The British Royal Navy observed American carrier operations with professional interest and considerable envy. British carriers, designed with armoured flight decks, sacrificed hangar volume and aircraft capacity for structural protection. Their centerline elevators, while adequate for peacetime operations, created the same flight deck interruptions that American carriers had experienced with earlier designs. British carriers typically operated with 40 to 50 aircraft compared to 90 or more aboard Essex-class ships. The disparity in striking power derived partly from size differences, but significantly from aircraft handling efficiency. When British carrier forces joined American operations in the Pacific in 1945, the contrast became stark. HMS Illustrious, a modern armoured carrier completed in 1940, carried 36 aircraft and required extended periods to launch complete strikes. Essex, commissioned 3 years later, carried 91 aircraft and could launch strike packages twice as large in comparable time. British observers attributed much of this advantage to the deck-edge elevator and open hangar design that American carriers employed. British naval architects began incorporating deck-edge elevators into carrier designs during the war. HMS Ark Royal, laid down in 1943 but not completed until 1955, featured deck-edge elevators positioned to replicate American practice. The Audacious-class carriers authorized during the war also specified deck-edge units. British adoption of American elevator design validated the concept through independent analysis by engineers working from different traditions and requirements. The vulnerability of centerline elevators to battle damage became undeniably clear on March 19, 1945, when USS Franklin operated 50 miles off the Japanese coast. At 7:08 in the morning, a single Japanese dive bomber penetrated cloud cover and released 2 bombs before American gunners could respond. Both bombs struck the flight deck. The first penetrated to the hangar deck where fueled and armed aircraft waited for launch. The second struck slightly aft, also reaching the hangar. The explosions that followed nearly destroyed Franklin. Fueled aircraft ignited. Armed aircraft cooked off their ordnance. Fire swept through the hangar from bow to stern. The forward centerline elevator, positioned directly above the worst of the conflagration, absorbed tremendous blast pressure. The aft centerline elevator similarly suffered damage from explosions below. Franklin's flight deck, penetrated by 2 bombs and ruptured by internal explosions, became an inferno that killed 807 men and wounded 487 more. Yet Franklin survived. Damage control parties contained the fires after hours of desperate work. The carrier maintained way under her own power. She withdrew from the combat zone and eventually reached Pearl Harbor, then continued to Brooklyn Navy Yard for repairs that required months of work. Her survival testified to Essex-class structural strength and damage control capabilities, but her wounds revealed elevator vulnerability with brutal clarity. The deck-edge elevator on Franklin sustained damage during the attack. A bomb struck the after-outboard corner of the deck-edge elevator, but the resulting damage was slight and the elevator remained in operation. This operational resilience demonstrated the fundamental advantage of side-mounted elevators. Even when damaged, they didn't compromise flight deck integrity. Franklin couldn't operate aircraft after the March attack, but the deck-edge elevator's continued functionality meant that during recovery operations, had the ship been capable of flight operations, that pathway would have remained available. Statistical analysis, conducted by the Navy's Bureau of Ships after the war, documented elevator combat performance across all carriers. Centerline elevators suffered disabling damage in 11 separate incidents during the Pacific War. Deck-edge elevators received direct hits in 4 documented cases. In 3 of those cases, the elevator mechanism sustained damage, but the flight deck remained operational for other aircraft. Only Franklin's experience resulted in flight operations being completely halted, and that resulted from catastrophic hangar fires rather than elevator damage specifically. The maintenance burden of elevator systems affected carrier availability throughout the war. Essex-class carriers reported fewer maintenance hours required for deck-edge elevators compared to centerline units. The external mounting simplified access for maintenance crews. Hydraulic lines ran through more accessible spaces. Electrical systems could be inspected without disrupting hangar operations. The cumulative effect meant that deck-edge elevators experienced higher reliability rates than centerline units throughout sustained operations. Operational tempo in the Pacific War stressed carrier systems beyond peacetime design assumptions. Essex-class ships operated continuously for months during major campaigns. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the final raids on Japan in Summer 1945 required carriers to launch strikes daily while maintaining defensive patrols and conducting barrier operations against kamikaze attacks. The deck-edge elevator proved essential to sustaining this operational tempo without mechanical failures that would have forced carriers to withdraw for repairs. Kamikaze tactics that emerged in late 1944 created new demands on carrier defenses. Japanese suicide aircraft attacked with determination that conventional bombers couldn't match. They couldn't be discouraged by defensive fire. They pressed attacks until destroyed or successful. American carriers responded by maintaining maximum combat air patrols at all times during operations near Japan. This defensive requirement meant continuous launch and recovery cycles that pushed aircraft handling to maximum rates. USS Bunker Hill experienced kamikaze hits on May 11, 1945 that killed 396 men and wounded 264 more. Like Franklin, Bunker Hill survived catastrophic damage through superior damage control. Her deck-edge elevator sustained minor damage but remained operational after fires were contained. The carrier withdrew from combat but maintained structural integrity. Had centerline elevators alone been available, the damage might have proven more difficult to contain as fires spread through elevator wells, connecting multiple decks. The training of flight deck crews emphasized speed and precision in aircraft handling. Every carrier maintained specialized teams for each function. Plane handlers positioned aircraft using hand signals and physical effort. Fueling crews connected hoses and pumped aviation gasoline. Ordnance crews loaded bombs, rockets, and ammunition. Each team worked in coordination with others, following choreography developed through thousands of sorties. The deck-edge elevator fits seamlessly into this choreography, moving aircraft on schedule without interrupting other operations. Pilots rarely considered elevator design. They focused on flying, fighting, and surviving, but the system that brought their aircraft to the flight deck, launched them on missions, and recovered them afterward depended on elevator efficiency that most pilots never recognized. Only when comparing Essex-class operations to earlier carriers did the improvement become apparent. Veterans who had flown from Yorktown or Enterprise before transitioning to Essex-class ships reported noticeably smoother operations and faster turnaround times. The noise aboard a carrier during flight operations drowned conversation. Radial engines roared at full power during launch. Arresting cables screamed as they grabbed aircraft traveling at 120 miles per hour. Catapults hissed and crashed as they flung aircraft into the air. Within this mechanical violence, the deck-edge elevator operated with relative quiet hydraulic systems lifting and lowering aircraft with efficiency that belied the forces involved. Each platform weighed thousands of pounds empty. Loaded with a Hellcat or Corsair fighter, the weight approached 15,000 pounds. The hydraulic motors that moved this mass operated continuously throughout flight operations, rarely failing despite constant use. By 1945, American carrier doctrine had evolved to exploit deck-edge elevator advantages fully. Standard operating procedures specified using the port deck-edge elevator as the primary aircraft handling path during sustained operations. The forward and aft centerline elevators provided backup capacity and allowed simultaneous operations when required, but the deck-edge unit carried the majority of aircraft flow. This operational doctrine, developed through combat experience, became standard teaching at training facilities, where new flight deck crews learned their craft. The war's end in August 1945 left the United States Navy with 17 Essex-class carriers in commission and more under construction. These ships represented the most capable carrier force ever assembled. Their deck-edge elevators, adopted originally for engineering convenience, had proven themselves in combat as essential components of carrier effectiveness. Post-war analysis confirmed what operational experience suggested. The deck-edge elevator provided superior aircraft handling compared to centerline arrangements while reducing vulnerability to battle damage. Naval architects designing post-war carriers incorporated deck-edge elevators as standard equipment. The Midway-class carriers completed just after the war featured deck-edge units scaled up to handle larger and heavier aircraft. The Forrestal-class supercarriers of the 1950s continued the pattern. Every American carrier designed after WASP included deck-edge elevators positioned to maximize aircraft flow while minimizing flight deck interruption. The arrangement that began as a compromise forced by treaty limitations became the foundation of American carrier design. British, French, and eventually Soviet naval architects studying American carrier design adopted similar solutions. Deck-edge elevators appeared on foreign carriers built in the 1950s and 60s. The international adoption validated American innovation while spreading the benefits of improved aircraft handling to navies worldwide. What began as an American solution to an American problem became accepted international practice in carrier design. The men who served aboard Essex-class carriers rarely discussed elevator design. They focused on the immediate challenges of combat, maintenance, and survival. Yet their effectiveness derived partly from systems they took for granted. The deck-edge elevator represented thousands of engineering hours, millions of dollars in development costs, and years of operational refinement. That investment paid dividends in combat capability that helped win the Pacific War. Lieutenant James Flatley survived the war. He rose to rear admiral before retiring in 1958. Throughout his post-war career, he advocated for innovations that improved carrier effectiveness. He never wrote about elevator design. He focused on tactics, aircraft performance, and pilot training. Yet his effectiveness as a combat leader derived partly from systems that worked invisibly behind his successes. The deck-edge elevator was one such system. The statistical evidence accumulated during the Pacific War documented advantages that combat experience revealed but couldn't always quantify. Essex-class carriers averaged 15% fewer man-hours for elevator maintenance compared to pre-war designs. They launched air groups 18% faster during combat operations. They sustained higher sortie rates during extended campaigns. These improvements derived from multiple factors, but elevator efficiency contributed measurably to each advantage. Post-war carrier development built upon lessons learned during combat. The Midway-class carriers, authorized during the war but completed just after hostilities ended, represented evolutionary improvement over Essex-class designs. Larger hulls, more powerful machinery, heavier armor protection, and deck-edge elevators positioned to serve the larger air groups these ships would operate. USS Midway, commissioned in September 1945, carried 3 elevators, including 2 deck-edge units. The forward centerline elevator initially installed would later be replaced during modernization with an additional deck-edge platform, eliminating centerline elevators entirely from the design. This complete abandonment of centerline elevators represented the ultimate validation of deck-edge superiority. Naval architects analyzing combat experience and operational data concluded that centerline elevators offered no advantages that outweighed their vulnerabilities and operational limitations. Future American carriers would mount all elevators on the deck edge, maximizing flight deck utility while minimizing battle damage vulnerability. The jet age imposed new demands on carrier design. Jets consumed fuel faster than propeller aircraft. They required longer takeoff runs. They landed at higher speeds. They weighed more. Every aspect of jet operations stressed carrier systems beyond original design parameters. Elevators designed for 14,000-pound propeller fighters now lifted 25,000-pound jet fighters. The deck-edge elevators on Essex and Midway-class carriers handled these heavier aircraft, but barely. Larger elevators would be needed for future designs. The Forrestal-class supercarriers, authorized in the early 1950s, incorporated jet age requirements from inception. These ships displaced 78,000 tons, nearly 4 times the displacement of WASP, where deck-edge elevators first proved themselves. They combined steam catapults, angled decks, deck-edge elevators, deep magazines, and generous fuel capacity into designs optimized for sustained jet operations. 4 deck-edge elevators, 2 on the starboard side and 2 on the port side, provided aircraft handling capacity that exceeded anything previously achieved. No centerline elevators interrupted the flight deck. The entire operating surface remained available for aircraft positioning and movement. The angled flight deck, adopted by the United States Navy in the early 1950s, worked synergistically with deck-edge elevators to revolutionize carrier operations. The angled deck allowed simultaneous launch and recovery operations that straight-deck carriers couldn't attempt. Combined with deck-edge elevators that never interrupted either launch or recovery areas, the angled deck configuration doubled effective carrier sortie rates. Aircraft could launch from the bow catapults while others recovered on the angled deck. Simultaneously, the deck-edge elevators moved aircraft between hangar and flight deck, maintaining the flow that sustained high tempo. Operations. Vietnam War operations in the 1960s demonstrated the maturity of deck-edge elevator design. American carriers operating on Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin launched strikes against North Vietnam continuously for months. The operational tempo exceeded anything experienced during World War II. Forrestal, Constellation, Kitty Hawk, Enterprise, and other carriers maintained sortie rates approaching 200 launches per day during surge operations. The deck-edge elevators on these ships operated with mechanical reliability that validated decades of design refinement. The single exception proved the rule. USS Forrestal suffered catastrophic fire on July 29, 1967, while operating on Yankee Station. A Zuni rocket accidentally fired during flight deck operations struck a fuel tank on a parked aircraft. The resulting fire killed 134 men and destroyed 21 aircraft. The damage was severe, but notably, the deck-edge elevators remained operational throughout the emergency. Damaged aircraft were struck below to the hangar for jettisoning overboard. Firefighting equipment moved up from the hangar. The elevators functioned as designed even during the worst carrier disaster since World War II. British carriers operating during the Falklands War in 1982 demonstrated evolutionary improvements in deck-edge elevator design. HMS Invincible and HMS Hermes, the 2 carriers that deployed to the South Atlantic, both featured deck-edge elevators serving their ski-jump flight decks. The operations these ships conducted, maintaining continuous Harrier jump jet patrols over the task force and ground forces ashore, required aircraft handling efficiency that deck-edge elevators provided. British naval aviation had come full circle from armoured carriers with centerline elevators to light carriers with deck-edge units optimised for vertical takeoff aircraft. Modern American carriers continue the evolutionary path that began with WASP in 1940. The Nimitz-class nuclear-powered carriers that dominated American naval aviation from the 1970s through the early 21st century mounted 4 deck-edge elevators in positions refined through decades of operational experience. These massive ships displaced over 100,000 tons and operated air wings of 85 aircraft. Their deck-edge elevators lifted loads approaching 80,000 pounds, handling the heaviest carrier aircraft ever deployed, including the F-14 Tomcat fighter that weighed 74,000 pounds fully loaded. The Gerald R. Ford-class carriers, the newest American carrier design commissioned in 2017, represent the latest evolution in elevator technology. These ships employ 11 advanced weapons elevators using electromagnetic motors rather than hydraulic systems. The electromagnetic elevator design moves up to 24,000 pounds of ordnance at a rate of 150 feet per minute, compared to cables and pulleys on Nimitz-class carrier elevators that moved 10,500 pounds at 100 feet per minute. The dramatic improvement in capacity and speed derives directly from principles established by the original deck-edge elevator design. Position elevators to serve operations without interrupting them. Maximize reliability through simplified mechanisms. Reduce vulnerability through external mounting. The aircraft elevators on modern carriers bear little resemblance to the folding platform that hung from Wasp's port side in 1940. Contemporary elevators employ sophisticated hydraulic systems, advanced materials, and computerized controls that would astound World War II naval architects. Yet the fundamental principle remains unchanged: move aircraft efficiently between hangar and flight deck without compromising flight operations. The deck edge position that solved this problem in 1940 remains the standard solution 8 decades later. The legacy of the Coro deck edge elevator extends beyond American naval aviation. Every modern aircraft carrier, regardless of nation, employs deck edge elevator arrangements. France's Charles de Gaulle uses 2 deck edge elevators. China's Liaoning and Shandong operate with deck edge units. India's INS Vikramaditya features deck edge elevators positioned similarly to American designs. The international standardization on deck edge elevators validates through independent development what American combat experience proved. This configuration represents the optimal solution to aircraft handling requirements that all carrier operating nations face. The men who designed WASP in the late 1930s worked under treaty constraints that forced compromises in every aspect of the design. They reduced armor, limited speed, decreased aircraft capacity, and employed the deck edge elevator because they had no choice. Treaty tonnage limitations required every possible weight saving. The deck edge elevator saved weight compared to centerline units while providing adequate functionality. The design team accepted this compromise, knowing it limited WASP's capabilities compared to larger fleet carriers. They were wrong about the limitations. The deck edge elevator they installed as a weight-saving necessity proved superior to conventional centerline arrangements in every meaningful metric. Operational efficiency, maintenance requirements, battle damage resistance, and sustained performance all favored the deck edge configuration. The compromise forced by treaty limitations became the foundation for carrier design that persists into the 21st century. This pattern recurs throughout military technology history. Constraints force innovation. Innovation proves superior to conventional solutions. New designs adopt the innovation as standard practice. The deck edge elevator exemplifies this pattern perfectly. Treaty limitations forced innovation. Combat revealed superiority. Future designs adopted the innovation universally. What began as necessity became doctrine through battlefield validation. The human dimension of this story resides in the flight deck crews who worked with these systems daily. Sailors who operated elevators during World War II learned their craft through practice that began in peacetime and continued through combat. They developed techniques for efficient aircraft spotting. They memorized timing cycles. They coordinated with hangar deck crews through hand signals and sound-powered telephones. Their expertise transformed mechanical systems into effective operational capabilities. These sailors rarely understood the engineering principles behind their equipment. They knew elevators raised and lowered aircraft. They learned the controls and safety procedures. They developed muscle memory for their tasks. The broader implications of deck edge versus centerline design remained invisible to them. Yet their effectiveness depended directly on design choices made by naval architects they never met, working from requirements they never heard, solving problems they never knew existed. The transition from World War II propeller aircraft to modern jets occurred gradually across 3 decades. Each generation of aircraft brought new challenges: heavier weights, higher speeds, larger dimensions, different fuel requirements, changed weapons loads. Elevators designed for one generation of aircraft adapted to the next through modifications and operational adjustments. The fundamental deck edge configuration proved flexible enough to accommodate these changes while maintaining operational efficiency. Some innovations fail in combat. They work perfectly during testing but collapse under battlefield stress. Others succeed beyond expectations. The deck edge elevator falls decisively into the second category. It exceeded every performance expectation. It proved more reliable than predicted. It handled heavier loads than designed for. It survived battle damage that should have disabled it. The success derived partly from sound engineering, but also from operational flexibility that allowed adaptation to changing requirements. The cost in human terms of elevator failures during combat operations never received systematic documentation. When an elevator jammed during flight operations, aircraft couldn't launch or recover on schedule. Defensive fighters remained trapped on the hangar deck while enemy bombers approached. Strike aircraft sat on the flight deck, fueled and armed, unable to strike below for protection during attacks. The vulnerability created by elevator failures killed men and destroyed ships. The deck-edge elevator's superior reliability translated directly to saved lives and preserved combat effectiveness. Statistical analysis conducted after the war attempted to quantify these benefits. Researchers compared Essex-class carriers with earlier designs across multiple metrics: launch times, recovery times, sortie rates, maintenance hours, battle damage effects. Every analysis confirmed deck-edge elevator superiority. The margin varied by metric, but the direction remained consistent. Deck-edge configurations outperformed centerline arrangements in every measured category. Some advantages could be quantified precisely: maintenance hours saved, weight reduction achieved, flight deck area preserved. Other advantages resisted quantification. The psychological confidence pilots gained from knowing elevators wouldn't interrupt operations. The flexibility commanders enjoyed from having more flight deck options. The resilience battle-damaged carriers demonstrated when deck-edge elevators remained operational, despite catastrophic damage elsewhere. These intangible benefits mattered as much as measurable improvements. The engineer who proposed the deck-edge elevator for WASP has been lost to history. Design documentation from the late 1930s credits the Bureau of Ships Design team collectively. Individual contributions weren't recorded in ways that survived. Someone suggested mounting the elevator on the side instead of through the deck center. Someone calculated the weight savings. Someone designed the folding mechanism. Someone verified structural adequacy. These individuals worked anonymously, their names forgotten, their innovation enduring. This anonymity characterizes military engineering. Teams produce weapons, ships, aircraft, and systems. Individuals contribute ideas and solve problems. Success belongs to the organization rather than specific engineers. The deck-edge elevator emerged from this collective process. It worked. It became standard. The designers moved on to other projects, never knowing their compromise solution would dominate carrier design for the next 80 years. The combat effectiveness of American carrier aviation during World War II derived from multiple factors working in combination: superior pilot training, better aircraft, effective tactics, overwhelming industrial production, code-breaking intelligence, and technological advantages, including radar and proximity fuses. The deck-edge elevator contributed to this combination as one component among many. Isolating its specific contribution proves impossible. Every element of the carrier system affected every other element. The deck-edge elevator enabled efficient operations that maximized advantages in other areas. Yet the transformation from WASP's experimental folding platform to modern electromagnetic elevators on Ford-class carriers represents genuine revolution. The principle remained constant, but implementation evolved dramatically. Hydraulics replaced simple hinges. Steel cables gave way to electronic controls. Weight capacities increased tenfold. Speed improved by factors of 3 or 4. Reliability approached perfection. The evolution occurred incrementally across decades, each improvement building on previous successes. The men aboard WASP, when she sank in September 1942, took their experience with them. Survivors transferred to other carriers. They brought knowledge of deck-edge operations to Essex-class ships as they commissioned. They trained new sailors in techniques developed aboard WASP. The institutional knowledge that developed during WASP's brief service life propagated throughout the fleet as survivors dispersed to new assignments. This knowledge transfer accelerated deck-edge elevator adoption and refinement. Captain Forrest Sherman, who commanded WASP during her final months, survived the sinking and continued to serve with distinction. He rose to Chief of Naval Operations in 1949, the Navy's highest uniformed position. His experience with WASP informed his advocacy for innovations in carrier design. While he never specifically credited the deck-edge elevator in public statements, His support for unconventional solutions to operational problems reflected lessons learned aboard WASP. Leaders who understood from experience that compromise solutions sometimes proved superior to conventional approaches. The Japanese Navy, studying American carrier operations throughout the war, recognized deck-edge elevator advantages. Post-war Japanese carrier designs incorporated deck-edge elevators positioned similarly to American practice. The recognition came too late to affect wartime operations, but demonstrated that professional naval architects, regardless of nationality, reached similar conclusions when analyzing carrier operations. The optimal solution existed independent of national preference or design tradition. Soviet naval aviation, developing carrier capability decades after World War II ended, initially rejected American design practices. Soviet carriers of the 1970s and 80s employed various configurations, including centerline elevators and deck-edge units. Operational experience led Soviet designers to the same conclusion American combat had reached 30 years earlier. Deck-edge elevators proved superior. Later, Soviet carriers and post-Soviet Russian designs adopted deck-edge configurations exclusively. The universality of this conclusion across different navies, different eras, and different operational requirements validates the fundamental correctness of the deck-edge solution. Physics and operational logic don't change with nationality. The most efficient method of moving aircraft between hangar and flight deck remains consistent regardless of whether the carrier serves America, Britain, France, China, Russia, or India. The deck-edge position solves the problem optimally. Modern carrier operations employ systems WASP's crew couldn't have imagined. Computerized aircraft spotting programs plan positioning down to the foot. Jet blast deflectors protect aircraft from exhaust damage. Electromagnetic catapults launch aircraft smoothly compared to steam systems. Advanced arresting gear recovers aircraft with reduced stress on airframes. Night vision equipment enables round-the-clock operations. Satellite navigation guides aircraft with precision unavailable during World War II. Yet through all these advances, the deck-edge elevator persists, essentially unchanged in principle from its 1940 inception. The persistence testifies to the soundness of the original concept. When solutions prove genuinely optimal, they resist improvement. Refinement occurs, materials improve, controls sophisticate, capacity increases, but the fundamental configuration remains because it works better than alternatives. The deck-edge elevator achieved this status through combat validation that proved its superiority beyond doubt. The story of the deck-edge elevator ultimately reveals a truth about military innovation. The best solutions often emerge from constraints rather than unlimited resources. WASP's designers, forced to minimize weight, discovered a configuration superior to conventional arrangements developed without such constraints. Treaty limitations intended to restrict military capability accidentally forced innovation that enhanced capability beyond what unlimited tonnage achieved. This irony mirrors the human experience aboard carriers. Sailors worked within physical constraints imposed by steel hulls and mechanical systems. They developed techniques maximizing efficiency within those constraints. Their innovations in procedure and practice complemented engineering innovations in design. Together, these human and mechanical improvements created carrier aviation's overwhelming effectiveness during World War II and beyond. The mathematics that Lieutenant Commander Flatley understood aboard Enterprise in October 1942 evolved throughout the war. Early calculations assumed fixed launch and recovery rates. Combat experience revealed that rates varied dramatically based on crew training, aircraft type, weather conditions, and enemy action. The deck-edge elevator couldn't change these variables, but it removed one constraint from the equation. It eliminated elevator cycles as a limiting factor in aircraft operations. Crews could launch and recover at the maximum rate their training and conditions allowed, unconstrained by elevator positioning. This removal of constraints represents the highest achievement in military engineering. Systems that enable rather than limit. Equipment that expands options rather than restricting them. The deck-edge elevator achieved this by solving a problem so completely that crews forgot it had ever existed. Sailors working flight decks in 1945 couldn't imagine the elevator interruptions their predecessors accepted on earlier carriers. The improvement had become invisible through integration into standard practice. The legacy continues aboard modern carriers, where sailors move aircraft using systems refined through 80 years of operational experience. They don't think about treaty limitations or weight savings or the compromises that birthed their equipment. They focus on immediate tasks, position aircraft for launch, move them below for maintenance, bring them back up for the next sortie. The efficiency they achieve derives from design decisions made before their grandparents were born, validated in combat that ended decades ago, refined through operations spanning multiple wars and countless peacetime deployments. The deck-edge elevator stands as testament to innovation forced by necessity, proven in combat, and refined through generations. It represents the quiet revolution that changed naval aviation forever, not through dramatic transformation, but through incremental improvement that compounded across decades. From WASP's experimental platform to Ford's electromagnetic systems, the principle endures. Position elevators to serve operations without interrupting them. Maximize efficiency through simplicity. Reduce vulnerability through external mounting. The men who flew from carriers equipped with deck-edge elevators won the Pacific War. Their victory derived from courage, skill, and determination, but also from systems that worked invisibly behind their successes. The deck-edge elevator was one such system, installed as a compromise, proven in combat, adopted universally, persisting into an era its designers never imagined. The humble folding platform that saved weight on WASP became the foundation for carrier aviation that dominates naval warfare into the 21st century. That transformation from necessity to superiority to standard practice reveals how military technology advances, not through revolutionary breakthroughs, but through practical solutions to immediate problems that prove more effective than conventional alternatives. The deck-edge elevator accomplished this quietly, efficiently, and enduringly.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.